too, because it deals with, to some extent, trade law, intellectual property, all of those nice things that have made a great many lawyers very rich, I can tell you. Anyway, welcome back, everybody. Thank you for those who've been at more than one of these things. Thank you, Jane and some others, for turning up. Ron. And thank you to Mark and, of course, the board of Green College for tolerating all this. And actually, before beginning, I did want to take a moment to salute Sonny Mehta, who died in New York just before Christmas at the age of 77. He was only the third publisher in the history of Knopf, which I think is a great publishing house, in its distinguished 104-year history. His predecessors were the founder himself, Alfred, and his wife Blanche, who never got enough credit, followed by Bob Gutley, still in the business, still agenting, still writing music reviews, in fact. And in every respect, Sonny was a passionate, gracious, and brilliant publisher. And I think both Peter Meyer and Sonny Mehta in 1 year has stripped the book publishing business of two of its 20th century giants. Both these two people that were cut from a different mold, in my view.
Clyne, I'm only interposing myself because I noticed you're not wearing a microphone.
Well, what we decided was that I could project, and in fact, let me start there. If people at the back are going to have any trouble hearing me, shut it.
Or come forward.
It's okay.
Is it okay?
But the other issue is that if we don't have mics, this third lecture, unlike the other two...
No, Alan tells me that the mics up there will catch it.
Oh,
He and I discussed that.
He is confident in that, isn't he? Then
I'm only a servant.
Excuse my interference. I want people to be able to get
But
the
please,
results
if
set.
anybody is having any trouble hearing me, or I go too fast, it's true.
It's not
Okay, question. We'll cut this little intermission anyway.
All right, well, look. So this talk will actually conclude my personal take on the publishing world as I experienced it, although I have tried to maintain a balanced perspective when telling the post-war story. And this afternoon, I'll try to give you some sense of the evolving intellectual property protections the international world has devised, and which have become increasingly important to creators, particularly to those in small markets, aka Canada. The two critical strands have been copyright and the post-war development of new, far-reaching international trade agreements, mostly beneath the radar, but hugely influential. Copyright seems an appropriate place to begin and takes us back in history. For almost 3,000 years, since there have been books or extended writing of any kind, the notion of who legally owns the content has been a contentious business. When Gutenberg came along in the great 15th century, and Marcus reminded me he didn't invent movable type, the Chinese did, and of course it was just borrowed by the West. But it allowed, in the West, the creation of multiple copies of text. And this democratized a process which had up to then been the result of diligent monks or scribes hand copying manuscripts, usually under the thumb of religious or temporal masters. Words, their authors, and all too often their ideas were an existential threat, and therefore needed to be controlled and censored by political power. A system to monitor and to control this led to church or state intervention, and the beginning of what we now know as copyright protection. It is, sorry for misquoting Jane Austen, it is universally accepted now that the fundamental right of creators is to own their work. But enshrining that right in law took many legal and political battles to pry it out of the hands of kings and the church. More than a few heads rolled during the process. The first legal challenges go back to Rome, when ownership was viewed as a public good, and writing was automatically considered the property of the state. The first known actual copyrights dispute occurred in 560 of the Common Era, in Ireland, in fact, between St. Columba and St. Finian over the latter's right to own a copy of his Latin Psalter made by the former. The King of Ireland resolved the issue, siding with Finian, summing up his judgment with the words, "To every cow belong its calf, so to every book belong its copy." Life has become slightly more complicated since. Historically, with the new possibilities offered by Gutenberg's type and its related machines, printer publishers were granted exclusive privileges. The earliest on record were issued by the Senate of Venice in 1469. And a few years later, such privileges were granted to William Caxton in Westminster. By 1518, privileges were granted to Richard Pinson, the king's printer, and by 1534, Henry VIII had granted a royal charter to Cambridge University. The caveat was that all new books printed in England had to be approved by the Privy Council before publication. This may sound extreme, but a similar system prevails in China, where the granting of ISBNs, the equivalent of the legal right to publish, has traditionally been controlled by the states. Certainly up to 10 years ago, that was the case in Shanghai, I know.
Venezuela today. In Venezuela today.
Well, I'm sure it's in many places, but that's a different issue so far. The tradition of the British Crown to grant monopolies to certain trades in exchange for loyalty was established in 1507 by King Philip and Queen Mary when they granted a royal charter to the stationery company. The grant of copyright protection had always been associated with royal privilege, and the copying of books always constrained by the shadow of censorship. Given the profound social changes which the wide dissemination of books and their contents triggered, it is no surprise that established power was wary of the rabble feeling empowered. It just took a few centuries for the full impact of the forces unleashed to lead to revolution. Even in the 18th century, copyright accrued more to stationers, booksellers, licensed by their guild and the crown than it did to the lowly creators. In the UK, a parliamentary debate of the time reflected the view of the aristocracy. Bookseller publishers were dismissed as scribblers for bread who teased the press with their perishable trash. Some people still think that's the case. The first copyright law in the UK was passed by the English Parliament in 1710 and is still referred to as the Statute of Anne in honor of the monarch who ordered it done. Among its innovations was granting publishers 14 years of protection for new books and 21 years for books already in print. France followed suit in 1793, Austria in 1832, and Germany in 1835. But the sponsoring monarch's primary interests remained granting privileges of copyright as their ancestors had granted lands. By the late 19th century, can you hear me back there? By the late 19th century, the number of new books and the markets they reached had exploded. Soon, eager American publishers were engaged in widespread and very profitable piracy. It is no longer widely remembered that many of the oldest and most established American publishing houses were built on the backs of pirating bestsellers from the UK. The scale of this activity increased international pressure on the need for some type of legal or at least moral constraint. Harper Brothers, which morphed into Harper & Row and is now the mighty HarperCollins, owned by Rupert Murdoch, benefited hugely but from the lack of any international copyright law. In 1853, Harper was the largest publishing house in the world, with 750 employees, 16 separate buildings in Boston, and a backlist of 1,500 titles, including some 700 new titles and 800 new editions. Even by the mid-19th century, scale was beginning to dominate. English publishing also exploded during the 19th century, with many of the fine old houses whose names remain recognizable, Castles, Heinemann, John Murray, John Lane, Longman, Potter Stoughton, thriving. It was not uncommon for books to sell several 100,000 copies, which, while fine for the UK publisher, opened the tempting door for the American pirates. By the 1870s, it was clear that the rather feebly enforced existing rights of authors were inadequate. And in an age of rapidly evolving communications technologies, isolated single-nation rights were increasingly recognized as futile. European writers, with Victor Hugo influential amongst the leading voices, were aggressively pushing for stronger protection for artistic property and were proposing such new ideas as national treatment. Writers from one country should be given the same rights in all other countries that had signed equivalent agreements. Critically, the notion that treaties dealing with artistic property should be treated separately and differently from those dealing with commercial property was beginning to gain traction. As we shall see, that idea refused to die as the world evolved. In Europe, the Gathering Storm resulted in a groundbreaking meeting of authors, publishers, booksellers, composers, and music houses in Rome in 1882. That led to a follow-up convention in Bern, Switzerland, 4 years later, when the cornerstone of international copyright protection, the Bern Convention, was signed. The following year, it was adopted by most of Europe and many other countries, including Canada. In essence, this enshrined the principle of an artist's ownership of personal material as a property right, and national treatment prevailed. The soft underbelly was that no set term for the length of protection was agreed, and that was left up to individual countries. The United States remained aloof and did not actually sign the convention for almost a century, partially because of its insistence on copyright having to be formally and legally registered. In most of the rest of the world, copyright protection only required evidence that material had been made public in any way. In 1893, the United International Bureau for the Protection of Intellectual Property, bureaucrats love this stuff, was set up to administer the Bern Convention. And that body moved to Geneva in 1960, and 10 years later, WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, replaced it. By 1974, WIPO became formally part of the UN, in my view as much a curse as a blessing, although it now enjoys a membership of 160 countries. In most countries, the term of life plus 50 years was made mandatory in 1948. Only recently, that restrictive term has begun to be softened, significantly under pressure from Disney and other American legacy media businesses with huge intellectual property assets. And now 35 countries have moved to a term of death plus 70, including the US, the UK, and many European countries. Canada, alas, is not yet one of them. The Canadian Copyright Law Act came into effect in 1924, and while it was tinkered with from time to time, the modernization of the Act did not begin until 1988. The Canada-US Free Trade Agreement forced some amendments, specifically related to the electronic media, and they became law with the passage of a bill in 1993. The second stage of reform was passed in 1997. We are just a bit behind the 8 ball here. One of the curses of any discussion about copyright is that it seems to bring out the worst in people and inevitably pits bureaucrats and process-oriented linear thinkers against what are all too often viewed as the loose cannons of the creative community. Such lapses into emotional rhetoric often hurt the cause, even though in truth these voices need to be heard. In my universe, creative rights must come first. The digital revolution has, of course, knocked all of this previously received wisdom into a cockpit, and we are living in an electronic Wild West. But that is another story. democracy have returned. It's never really left us. And chaos always looms just over the horizon. Nothing there new. Nothing new there. Mark Twain's wisdom prevails. Only one thing is impossible for God, to find any sense in any copyright law on the planet. And actually, Jack McClellan had a more succinct version of that. Copyright is the most complex and boring subject known to man. I recall a private session in the office of Judith Rock, then Deputy Minister of Canadian Heritage. And this was, the two of us were alone. The very thought of having to deal with copyright law caused her to roll her eyes and lament, God spare us from having to go there again, even though we know we must. There was no question in her mind about the necessity and urgency of the issue, just visible dismay at the processes addressing the addressing of copyright violations. And Mark Twain again, whenever a copyright law has to be made or altered, then the idiots assemble. The miracle is that progress occurs at all. Let me now turn to really the heart of this talk, international trade, cultural policy, and the Canadian experience. Again, let me begin with some history. Following the end of World War II, the world optimistically embraced what leaders hoped would become a new international trading environment, one which would fuel economic expansion while blunting any instinct for another devastating war. The Europeans were particularly sensitive to this, having just endured the bloodiest century in what had always been a bloody history. American hegemony made this easier, as at the time, the U.S. had clearly emerged as the richest and strongest nation on the planet. Importantly, the U.S. was then governed by a literate, well-educated political class with an appreciation of the world and a determination to help build a more stable and prosperous environment. The cornerstone post-war initiative was the signing of the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1947. While that focused primarily on financial matters, it launched what became known as the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, the GATT, which was dedicated to liberalizing the global trade in goods. By 1995, the GATT had morphed into the World Trade Organization, WTO, which in turn initiated the General Agreement on Trade in Services, an outgrowth of the GATT intended to regulate things other than manufactured goods. Now, the creative industries, particularly film, were caught in the vice. Two key principles affecting international activity, most favored nation and national treatment, were considered basic and were to become problematic for small countries such as Canada, trying to carve out space in their home markets for their own cultural products. These same principles had hung menacingly over all negotiations during the FTA, U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement, and its successor NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Canada had found itself constantly on the defensive, given our desire to preserve space for our publishing, broadcasting, music, film, and television companies. This may sound arcane, but as we shall see, it produced much angst while fueling the careers of a great many lawyers. Ultimately, it pushed Canada to become a leader in the broad international movement to circumvent the legal restrictions of trade law while fighting for a new regime which would acknowledge that cultural products differ from other categories of goods. I think there's some water here. Language, which was developed during this process, has found its place in all Canada's recent trade agreements, including CETA, the CTP, CTTPP, and even apparently in the about to be ratified USMCA. For anyone dismayed by this murky alphabet soup, I can only offer the words of one of our senior trade negotiators, and he uttered them only half in jest. I speak 3 languages, English, French, and African.
What?
And during this time, the notion of a cultural exemption, which was actually a Canadian invention, entered the vocabulary of trade law to the great benefit of the international creative community. And the cultural exemption was an attempt to legally separate cultural products from those pragmatic things that the rest of the world thinks are more important. And it took a long time for it to win, but it did. My point is that Canada, working with France and a few other countries, kept culture on the table. Those were the phrases that the negotiators used during the post-war trade liberalization debates. And in doing so, we managed a significant end run on the Americans, who thought scale alone should trump everything else. Sort of a bit of fun. Culture, in its broadest sense, that fabric of history, myth, storytelling, and the expression of hopes and dreams is central to any functioning society. More importantly, it is the fundamental glue which ensures healthy personal and political relationships. Simply put, culture animates a country's sense of itself. In Canada's case, Quebec has been a significant factor, always aware of the urgency to protect its language. That emotional issue has partially defined our remarkable faith in the value of diversity. It is this perseverance, however tested from time to time, and we're going to see a lot more of that, which characterizes our federation and distinguishes it from so many other places. But it is a fragile virtue and often undervalued. In my view, it has been fundamental to allowing the survival of our country. From early in Canada's history, politicians have seen the need for the balancing effect of public policy to offset the commercial disadvantages of small scale and the overpowering messages crossing our southern border. The establishment of the CBC in 1936 was a promising beginning. In 1949, as the shadows of the Depression and World War II dissipated, the Royal Commission on National Development in the Arts, Letters, and Science, known as the Massey Commission, was struck. That seminal undertaking lamented the moribund state of the arts in Canada, extending its censure to those mostly feeble institutions which nourished them. Canada was an utter vacuum for the arts in those days. Among the results were the establishment of the National Library in 1956, or 1953, and critically, the launching of the Canada Council in 1957. As a post-war generation, impatient with the old order, began to assert itself, the growth of what are now called the creative industries, books, magazines, film, television, and sound recording, accelerated. And as the new electronic media began to dominate, the conundrum of how to ensure space for Canadian voices revealed itself more starkly. One result was the establishment of the Board of Broadcast Governors in 1958, which 10 years later became the Canadian Radio and Television Commission. And by the way, there's a report just submitted to Cabinet in Ottawa now, which has some fairly strong language, and one of the things that is about to happen, I think it's probably at the end of this month, is the CRTC, they lamented, will get a name change. In 1971, regulations required a certain percentage of Canadian music content to be played on radio were introduced, and while greeted with much derision at the time, have proven remarkably successful. The Canada Council was expanding its programs, and some provinces, notably Quebec and Ontario, were getting into the Cultural Act. Telling the country's stories was seen as a necessary and fundamental building block for the new Canada, and government was listening. By the late 20th century, Canada's creative industries accounted for over $3 billion in revenue, or 3% of Canada's GDP, employed some 600,000 Canadians, and were growing at a rate of about 10% a year, outstripping such key industries as transportation, agriculture, and construction, which they in turn were incubators for the now exploding knowledge industries, while becoming an ever more important part Canada's international brand. And of course, they were green. By 2007, this sector had grown to almost $85 billion in revenues, over 7% of GDP. Yet many of the new enterprises, particularly the smaller ones, remain fragile as economic entities under the constant threat of lack of scale. With deep pockets and their consequent dominance in a large home market, American cultural entities were becoming ever more intrusive. Canadian-owned entities control less than 10% of movie and television screens, and most of that was in Quebec. And the market disparities were growing. The same disparity prevailed throughout the creative sector. Books were actually something of an exception to that, with Canadian content being steadily squeezed out. All this was before the full impact of the digital revolution and the explosive emergence of the FANGs. I think you probably all know what the FANGs are. And depending on the scale of the companies, it keeps changing. By the 1980s, the post-war trade environment of the General Agreement on Trade and Tariff and its proliferating brethren was exerting ever more influence, putting huge additional pressure on countries to waive their right to enforce cultural policies, which were viewed as anti-business and anti-open borders. A few countries, such as France, where culture was viewed as a birthright, pushed back. In 1995, during the Uruguay round, I won't get into all of that, during the Uruguay round of the General Agreement on Trade and Services, the GATS, the French fought hard for an audiovisual annex, in effect putting a ring fence around film and television. As one wry Canadian trade negotiator pointed out, in a rapidly advancing digital world, that was like rebuilding the Maginot Line. The French didn't appreciate the sarcasm. In a world of such flux, the cultural community in Canada began to exert increasing pressure on government to fight back for the right of Canadians to have access to Canadian stories. Once again, Quebec took the lead. Then, in the early 1980s, the Mulroney government opened negotiations which were to lead to a bilateral free trade deal with the U.S., initiating what was to become the FTA, later expanded to NAFTA when Mexico joined in 1994. Angst about selling out was everywhere, nowhere more so than in the cultural community. Loud voices were insisting that our birthright was being sacrificed to establish commercial interests. In response, one of the smart things the Mulroney government did was to create a suite of 15 working groups by industrial sector to advise negotiators during what was sure to become high-stakes horse racing. And indeed it was. And by the way, our lead negotiator was Simon Reisman, Heather's father. And let me tell you, this guy was a force of nature. And nobody tackled with him without feeling the pain. And one of those groups was something called the Arts and Culture Sectoral Group on International Trade, later renamed the Cultural Industry Sectoral Group on International Trade, known in acronym speak as a SAGIT. In my cynical moments, after one particularly wild and undisciplined meeting, I came to think of it as an acronym just desperately searching for a mandate. Not rigorous. The apocryphal backstory attributes this late addition of a body dealing with culture to a lecture from Mila Mulroney to her husband, berating him for, once again, ignoring the arts. Whatever its foundation myth, the SAGIT system was established, and that's where I entered the story. I joined the system in 1986 and remained within it until it was disbanded in 2005. During that period, including 2 years as chair from 1996 to 1997, I had a front row seat on all of Canada's trade negotiations, both completed and stillborn, and witnessed firsthand the level of ministerial involvement, the skill and conviction of our trade negotiators, and, all too often, the theatrics of the creative community reacting to news which seemed to threaten cultural sovereignty. It's during this period that the Canadian position of a cultural exemption was first articulated fleshed out and in the end successfully fought for against significant American opposition. The thought that anything might impede the free flow of American cultural products, particularly movies, into the captive Canadian market, usually at little risk and great profit, was anathema to the Americans, particularly during the presidency of Ronald Reagan, once a Hollywood actor. At the end of a long and arduous journey, Canada won significant cultural concessions, and believe me, there were screaming matches. And language enshrining a cultural exemption, meaning culture not like other things, was included in the FTA, then later in the expanded NAFTA, and great credit to skillful negotiators and political will in all our signed trade agreements since. This was a very significant victory, and it clarified that cultural products were different from more prosaic commodities, and their unimpeded creation and dissemination were fundamental sovereign rights, equivalent to the protections offered by healthcare and national defense. The breakthrough enshrined the right of Canada to make its own policies to protect cultural values without reprisal. The sanctioned weapons included the use of such policy measures as quotas, subsidies, expenditure requirements for the generation of unique content, and even the poison pill of ownership regulation. This principle was to evolve into the protections now enshrined within the UNESCO Universal Declaration on Cultural Diversity, signed in 2005. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Of course, there were setbacks along the way. One in particular, when Canada attempted to protect its national magazine publishers by moving against such magazines as Time and Reader's Digest, which were dumping their American editions into the country while siphoning off scarce advertising dollars, the so-called split-run legislation was introduced to mitigate such activities. The U.S. took the case to the new WTO, and in 1998, Canada lost. So the WTO was oblivious to the curious economics of cultural products. This was a profound shock in many courts and drove home to the Canadian government its vulnerabilities in the new trading environment. As these and other issues were steadily arising, and the initiation of a new round of trade negotiations was imminent, there was growing pressure on countries such as Canada to waive their right to enforce nationalist cultural policies. This meant putting all aspects of the cultural sector on the table, which would effectively allow the American element to control the agenda. Such issues were amongst many being discussed at the SAGIT, and in the fray of trade negotiations, culture always seemed to be an emotional sticking point, an ongoing irritant to the business community and to the Americans. Inevitably, public policy measures were dismissed as protectionism, when in fact their core intent was only to preserve some space in the Canadian marketplace for Canadian stories, not to blunt or limit the success of others. A quick digression, I had this conversation with Wade Davis's father-in-law once, the Senator Charles Percy, who was almost president of the U.S. then. And it was in the media, but what are you doing? You're blocking us. You're not letting our films in. So we had quite a spirited conversation. He was a great guy, by the way. But it was everywhere. And that kind of rhetoric was widely being used at almost every level. So in 1997, Art Eggleton, then Minister of International Trade, wistfully asked if the SAGIT couldn't offer him something better than protectionist rhetoric, which his international colleagues viewed as out of sync with the progressive world and counterproductive during contentious trade negotiations. I have to do this again. So with Canada's loss on the magazine file at the WTO, new trade initiatives underway, the launch of many preemptive bilateral negotiations, significantly by the U.S., and much additional pressure on countries to abandon any thought of exempting cultural policies from the growing basket of everything else, the discussions seemed more important than ever. Time was pressing in. Finally, one of our SAGIT members, the leading cultural lawyer and friend of mine, Peter Grant, suggested a possible new approach. What about pushing for a new international agreement dealing specifically with culture and trade, framed as protecting cultural diversity rather than some kind of cultural exemption? The model might be something in the spirit of the Landmine Treaty, which Lloyd Axworthy and his Canadian colleagues were then skillfully persuading the world to accept, which indeed they did. We understood that the powers within the WTO would never accept such a thing, but perhaps we could draft the drawings of an agreement to help define and clarify the issues. Such a draft might initially sit outside any existing formal entity, yet still influence public opinion and be useful inside and outside of government, even if remaining in legal limbo. We agreed to pursue this strategy as a kind of audacious end run on the system, with the next step being the preparation of a detailed report for the minister. And so it happened. In February 1999, the SAGIT delivered its report, titled, rather bureaucratically, Canadian Culture in a Global World, New Strategies for Culture and Trade. It advocated the creation of a new international instrument to enshrine the critical importance of cultural goods and services, acknowledge that cultural creations are different from other products, establish how responsible trade disciplines might cohabit with cultural measures, and set out rules guiding the appropriate domestic, regulatory, and other measures countries could use to enhance cultural and linguistic diversity. At its core was the fundamental importance of cultural achievement. And to our very pleasant surprise, the Canadian government formally accepted the idea later that year. At that time, we were blessed by having Sheila Cox as Minister of Canadian Heritage and our lead advocate. Over the next few years, ably and passionately supported by Minister of International Trade, Pierre Pettigrew, she pushed her international colleagues to consider the idea. Canadian ministers, plural, tirelessly advocated for it during every international visit and in every global forum they attended, even though, behind closed doors, they were often greeted with dismay verging on derision. Countries with healthy cultural industries thought the effort overkill. The U.S. absolutely hated it, of course, and countries outside the ambit of the English language didn't accept the necessity. Ultimately, with the French pushing Canada, a joint decision was made that such a treaty would best fit within UNESCO. This was certainly not the SAGIT's first choice, given that entity's less than stellar reputation for watered-down consensus and lack of clout, but it was time to be pragmatic. The French were persuasive, and Canada needed allies. Now, civil society was functioning in parallel with government and was having an impact. In Canada's case, this was led by something named the Coalition for Cultural Diversity, La Coalition pour l'Identité Culturelle, a group of Canadian and Quebec cultural associations led by an extraordinarily energetic executive director, Robert Pilon. This mirrored an equivalent entity the French had established in 1997. As always, Quebec was front and center, and the Quebec government was matching Ottawa's financial obligation. So the CCD was co-chaired by one French and one English cultural leader, each representing an industry association. From 2002 to 2009, I was the delegate from English Canada, nominated by the Association of Canadian Publishers. My Quebec colleague was Pierre Perdy, the well-known actor, and later Parti Québécois M&A. Great guy, I have to say. Over the next few years, the text of the proposed treaty was fleshed out in a series of ever higher-ranking international gatherings as its status inched up the UNESCO pecking order. Peter Grant had actually written an early draft to initiate discussion, and I recall him sheepishly continued to advance the idea with meetings in exotic international locations. And in October of 2003, UNESCO unanimously passed a resolution calling for the elaboration by 2005 of an international standard-setting convention. 2 more years of vetting and discussion followed, during which various experts were let loose on drafts of the document. And by 2004, a workable penultimate draft had been put forward, which was then handed off to an intergovernmental working group comprised of some 550 people from 132 member states. Unsurprisingly, the working document was riddled with square brackets indicating areas of disagreement. The chairman of the working group, Kadar Admal, a former minister in Nelson Mandela's cabinet, was tasked to making sense of all this. That took a week-long conference in Cape Town before a close to final version of the document was ready to circulate. Concurrently, lobbying at a very high level was persuading one country after another to join the cause. One notable breakthrough occurred when Jacques Chirac literally buttonholed Gerhard Schroeder in an airport and convinced him to support it, citing the necessity of European Union. Germany had been a staunch holder. In Africa, the countries of La Francophonie had persuaded other countries to join the growing consensus. Brazil persuaded many South American countries to come on board. China joined early on, and the momentum was defying the odds. The U.S. as always, was resisting, hiding behind the WTO, an irony indeed given the current U.S. stance. As final UNESCO negotiations were about to begin in October 2005, the U.S. panicked, and Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice played a last card by sending a personal letter to the ambassadors of all UNESCO member countries complaining, darkly hinting that should the draft be accepted, the U.S. might reconsider its new support for UNESCO. This was reinforced by direct lobbying by U.S. ambassadors around the world, with Pierre Pettigrew the target in Ottawa. In the end, these tactics proved too little, too late. At one of the most contentious moments, I was in Paris, wearing my hat as co-chair of the CCD, attending and speaking at a gathering of the European coalition. And you'll have to indulge me because it was an extraordinary event, and this account will give you some flavor of the intensity and high stakes of the ongoing machinations. The Paris event included some 300 invited guests, including Sheila Cox, who was to be one of the key speakers in recognition of her leading role during the march to the convention. I had flown directly to Paris overnight and was to speak, happily in English, the day following. All was well until a wisdom tooth erupted. To advance jet lag was added to an excruciating toothache. This was a very high-powered event, with some 30 distinguished, mostly European politicians assembled on the stage. Jacques Delpin was amongst them, as was Raymond Prédien, then our ambassador to France, plus a who's who of European cultural royalty. Early in the afternoon, Sheila Cox spoke brilliantly in French, English, and Spanish, mesmerizing the crowd. It was one of the finest speeches I'd ever heard from a Canadian politician, the sort of persuasive articulation of why culture matters that one would never hear in Canada. I was to be part of a panel later that afternoon, and the panel's preparation had been a formal briefing session deep in the bowels of the Carousel du Louvre, consisting of a long ramble in machine gun French, in a dark room reminiscent of the Black Hole of Calcutta. I couldn't begin to comprehend the instructions, which were flowing at a very great rate, and I joined the group, stumbling onto the stage, thinking that this was probably as good a way as any to die. Earlier, I had chatted with Sheila Cox, thinking that if she had spoken, she was going to leave. When I mentioned that I was speaking later that afternoon, she cheerfully said, "If you're going to speak, I'll stay to listen." not what I had hoped to hear. She had brought Wendy Lill, then the NDP culture critic, with her as part of her delegation. A reminder that there was one civilization in Ottawa. Now they were both going to listen. Soon I was on the stage, flanked by two senior French delegates. On my right was a very wealthy owner of a video game business whose central casting might have sent over as an example of a triumphant French world conqueror. And on my left, an avuncular retired senator who much liked the sound of his own voice. I was squeezed in the middle and in desperation realized I could only pretend that all was well and follow my notes with as much confidence as I could muster. Sheila Cox and Pierre Cordy were in the front row. When I had finished, to my very great relief, they confirmed that I had passed muster. I was just delighted to have survived at all. Because this was culture at the highest level. In Paris, the social events were exceptional. Following the day of presentations, we all trooped off to the Élysée Palace as Chirac's guests. Hanging around the bar at the back of the reception, I was taken aback when the women in the crowd suddenly surged forward in unison. Chirac himself had just walked into the room. He spoke eloquently about defending the central place of culture in a civilized world, and his remarks made headlines in the French press the next day. Naturally, they were completely ignored in Canada. We went from there to a civic reception in the Hotel de Ville, then to a government of Quebec reception in its embassy in Paris. Canada wasn't really going to do very much, but Quebec, of course, as always, wanted to be front and center. There I ran into Roger Talibert, the controversial architect of the Olympic Stadium in Montreal, with whom I had a very amusing conversation about Mayor Jean-Claude Poe and the circumstances surrounding Talibert's winning bid to design the stadium. The delicious details would be libelous if ever repeated in public. By the end of the evening, my toothache had disappeared, very good French wine, and these are good medicine. Much more importantly, the event was an effective tactic during the lobbying effort to win UNESCO's support for ratification of the Cultural Diversity Convention. And indeed, that occurred on October 20, with 148 votes in favor and only 2 dissenting votes of the U.S. and Israel. It passed. The convention came into force on March 18, 2007, and has since been ratified by some 145 countries. The degree of international support and the speed with which it had been ratified was unprecedented. Officially, it is named the Convention on the Protection and Promotion of the Diversity of Cultural Expressions. Ponderous, yes, but as a distinguished French economist once observed, one should not dismiss a child simply because her parents gave her an ugly name. The miracle isn't the convention exists at all. It firmly establishes the principle that cultural products are different from ordinary commodities and must be treated outside of the normal boundaries of commercial activity. The convention's signatories are not just able to implement new cultural policies with impunity, but critically are free to avoid taking any new measures which would limit cultural diversity. The convention gives individual countries the choice of whether or not to pursue further trade liberalization in the cultural sector without fear of trade retaliation. Critically, it does not restrict diversity. It is about access, not protection. Well, perhaps more symbolic than revolutionary, the convention was a dramatic win for the cultural community and for recognizing the central importance of the creative industry in a fraught world. The core of this story is that since Gutenberg's revolutionary, not invention, but born technology, and now the ubiquity of its massive siblings, there have been international efforts to mitigate the seesaw battle between public rights and the rights of creators and producers. As the financial scale and club of ever larger private sector companies has grown, government has fought for and retained the role of arbiter, usually in the face of much lobbying, screaming, and whining. The essential importance of ideas and free access to them, without impediment or censorship, complicated depths of intellectual property law, now made vastly more necessary by the so far undisciplined digital world, the role of Canadian creators, writers, artists, performers, and even Canadian producers, publishers, directors, recording studios, and film and television production companies has managed to secure a place in the sun. Copyright, ownership of intellectual property, and the legal ability of sovereign states to defend the right of their citizens to freely read, see, hear, and listen to their own stories has been a cornerstone achievement of our civilization. Long may the battle remain engaged, and long may those fighting